We mentioned in the last shiur that there are those that wait 3 hours in between meat and milk. And as we mentioned, the generally accepted custom is to wait 6 hours for Sephardim and recommended 6 hours for Ashkenazim, and strict halacha maybe a little bit less. But nobody, in most of the classic sources, nobody suggests that one would be required to wait 3 hours. And yet there are many Jews that come mainly from Germany, and today many Jews as well in England and a few other places that also wait 3 hours in between meat and milk. And the question is, exactly where did this custom come from? So if we look, one of the early sources, one of the Rishonim, Rabbeinu Yerucham, who actually, I believe, lived in Germany, so he is the sole commentary to discuss this point of 3 hours. And he simply says that the custom in his area was to wait 3 hours in between meat and milk. He doesn't explain why, and essentially no one else quotes that opinion of Rabbeinu Yerucham. So the later commentaries attempt to discuss what exactly is this based on, and where did he get this from, and do we indeed follow this? There's an interesting commentary of a sefer called the Mizmor LeDavid, Rav David Pardo, who discusses this custom and suggests that perhaps there is a logic for waiting 3 hours. And he points out that in Europe, in many places, they actually did not eat their supper meal so late in the evening, because at least during the winter time, it got dark, and still gets dark in the wintertime in Europe, very, very early. So many people in those days ate their lunch meal, let's say roughly around 12 o'clock. And then, when it began to get dark, around 3 or 4 o'clock in the wintertime, they would already begin eating their supper. And if you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense, because in those days they didn't really have electricity like we do today. So today you can eat dinner, can sit down with your family to have a nice meal really whenever you want, and you have light. Unless there's a blackout, of course. However, in those days, they didn't have electricity, and it would be much more difficult for them to eat after it got dark. And they sometimes had fires, but it was definitely not as easy as it would be today. So therefore, Rav David Pardo suggests, he claims that in those days, if in the wintertime they would eat their supper around 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, then really there would only be 3 or 4 hours in between their lunch meal and their dinner meal. So therefore, he suggests that even according to the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch, that one is required to wait 6 hours, the concept of waiting 6 hours is based on the Gemara of waiting between one meal and the next. The regular amount of time that one would wait in between one meal and the next would be sufficient. So in Europe, if the custom was to wait only 3 or 4 hours in between meals, then he claims that waiting between meat and milk also would only require 3 or 4 hours. And he suggests that, according to that opinion, we can say that the amount of time it takes to rid one's mouth of the taste of meat before eating milk, which was at least one of the reasons we suggested for waiting after meat, that we would only need 3 hours for. That's his approach, even though others would say that you need 6 to rid your mouth of the taste of the meat, or to be concerned about pieces of meat stuck in between your teeth. Those were the 2 reasons we gave for this idea of waiting after meat before eating dairy. He says that 3 or 4 hours, according to this, would apparently be sufficient. And this is what's followed in many, many places. And Rav Eli Ozarowski, in his sefer Yabia Omer, so he points out this opinion. Again, he doesn't necessarily say that everyone should follow it, but he points out that those that have this custom would be based on this concept of waiting only 3 hours, based on what they used to do in Europe of their lunch and their supper schedules. And what they explain is that even though this only took place in the wintertime, we can still say that even other times of the year as well, once it's practiced part of the year, you can also wait 3 or 4 hours at other times of the year as well, even in the summertime when your actual dinner meal is much later. Let's just discuss briefly 1 or 2 other interesting scenarios that come up when we analyze the question of waiting between meat and milk. One interesting question that comes up once in a while is, let's say that you made a mistake. Let's say that you started to make a bracha, you forgot that you had to wait 6 hours after eating meat, and you made a bracha on a glass of milk. Now what do? You're stuck. You don't want to not drink the milk because you already made the bracha, but at the same time you're supposed to wait 6 hours. So here, this is a question which is also dealt with by Rav Eli Ozarowski in the same responsum that he discussed the other point in Yabia Omer. And here he discusses the different opinions, and he points out that making a bracha and then not actually eating after the bracha is actually a bracha levatala. It would be a bracha in vain. And he says that's a very, very serious prohibition. Some say that that is rabbinical in nature, d'Rabbanan, and other Rishonim point out that that may be, they believe, it may be an Isser D'Oraisa, a biblical prohibition to wait, to not make a bracha which is attached to actually eating. So therefore he says that certainly for Ashkenazim, where the custom is to wait 6 hours, but the strict halacha is only to wait 1 hour at the most, and maybe even less than that, he says that you don't actually need to wait, and as long as it's after the very least, the very most 1 hour, maybe even less, you can already begin to drink your glass of milk after making the bracha, because the prohibition of bracha levatala is more severe than violating the custom of having milk after meat. And even for Sfardim, who wait 6 hours, again, if we hold that bracha levatala, that making a bracha in vain is a biblical prohibition, that's certainly worse than the rabbinic prohibition of waiting 6 hours. So that's one interesting case. Another case that comes up is for children, and this we don't have time to get into now, but a very, very interesting discussion about children. Do children have to wait 6 hours in between meat and milk? And here, what the poskim say is that for very young children, there's absolutely no need to wait 6 hours. However, for older children, from the age where they begin to understand these things, maybe from around age 6 or so, and maybe even a little bit less, some poskim say that they really should wait the entire 6 hours if they're able. But some children are not able to wait 6 hours, and for them, if they can wait 3 hours or 4 hours, it's a good idea to get them started on waiting between meat and milk, so that when they get a little bit older, they'll be familiar with the custom. Most poskim say that by age 9 or so, children are already capable of waiting 6 hours without too much of a problem, and by that point already we should try to enforce the waiting of 6 hours, similar to some other halachos that age 9 or 10 is also something which is an age which is significant.